join from London my expert in international affairs, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Welcome. Zelensky always refused the idea of meeting and holding dialogue with Russian President Vladimir Putin, a table of talks to reach a political solution. In your view, what is making Zelensky change his stance? And this also comes as we see changes in the European policy in the same direction.
On the day that the Russian army entered Ukraine in February of 2022, I said on television that Russia will decide when and how the war in Ukraine ends. And nearly 3 years on, that is all the more so today. Russia has taken everything that the Western ruling elites can throw at it. The Western ruling elites have imposed over 12,000 sanctions on Russia. The Western ruling elites have saturated Ukraine with military hardware, and yet, despite that, the Russian army continues to advance. The Russian High Command is implementing a brutal, ruthless strategy known as death by 1,000 cuts, or in more simple English, the Russian High Command is bleeding to death NATO's Ukrainian army. Thus, Russia will decide when and how the war in Ukraine ends. Russia will never tolerate a frozen conflict emerging in Ukraine. Russia will never tolerate the Ukrainian government in Kiev remaining in power. Why? Because that would allow NATO to rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces, and also the Ukrainian government in Kiev could take the decision to redraw its own borders, whereby it excludes the Crimea, it excludes the Donbass, it excludes Kherson, and it excludes Zaporozhye. In such a scenario, the pathway for Ukraine to NATO membership would be clear. So again, Russia will decide when and how the war in Ukraine ends. As for Zelensky, let me be brutally clear. Zelensky is merely a puppet.
It's clear what Russia is saying. The pledges for Ukraine not joining NATO and these regions which have become part of Russian geography to stay as such. This is a foundation for any talks. What Zelensky is proposing, he needs security, strong security guarantees from the West in exchange for an agreement and to sit on the table with 4 other powers, bearing in, or what is he talking about? Now, what Moscow says, is there any room for convergence, any code, maybe between Putin and Trump?
As I just said, Zelensky is a puppet. He is not an independent leader. He was selected by the Western ruling elites to rule Ukraine in a fashion that the Western ruling elites want Ukraine to be ruled in. So when Zelensky speaks, effectively, that is the Western ruling elites speaking. Zelensky is a mere puppet. He is a mere voice box, mouthpiece for the Western ruling elites. Russia will not even accept a written guarantee from the Western ruling elites that Ukraine, or what remains of Ukraine, will not join NATO. Russia understands that anything that comes from the mouths of Washington or London or Brussels means nothing. Now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, it can never be dislodged. Indeed, the Russian army will slowly but surely continue advancing westwards in Ukraine. And I have also said from the start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine that Russia will either capture all or most of Ukraine. And what the Russian army captures will be absorbed into the Russian Federation. I suspect that the westernmost part of Ukraine, those regions such as Lvov and Ternopil, close to the border with Poland, will not be captured by the Russians. I don't believe that the Russians want the population of the westernmost part of Ukraine in Russia, because those populations there have a lot of Polish, Lithuanian and Austrian blood in them, and naturally they are fervently anti-Russian. But I believe that the Russian army will advance to and capture the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia, and then will probably declare the war over. And then there will be just a rump steak left of Ukraine. But again, whatever Trump proposes, the Russians will not accept. And I believe that Trump is sincere when he says that he wants all wars to end. But he knows that the West started the war in Ukraine, and he knows that the Russians will not compromise when it comes to Ukraine. Ukraine is of absolute importance to Russian national security and is of absolute importance to the Russian national identity. So there could be a secret agreement between the Kremlin and the White House regarding Ukraine. There could be a trade-off, but one way or another, nothing will stop the Russian army from defeating the Ukrainian army.
What kind of, Dr. Papadopoulos, what kind of compromise? Zelensky said that his team communicated with Washington. An American delegation will visit Kiev soon. This is based on the stance he said when he expressed his readiness to hold talks with Putin. The Russian president doesn't want to sit with Zelensky. He considers him to be illegitimate and there should be elections, and that there's a expert Russian team which will work on this. But based on what kind of compromise could there be? What Zelensky referred to regarding the wealth Kiev has, the mineral wealth, which exists in the east and south, meaning where the operations are focused in Ukraine.
Again, you have to ignore Zelensky. You have to sideline him. When he talks, he is reading from a script which has been prepared for him by the Western ruling elites. Of course, he's not going to say in public that he's a puppet of the West. Naturally, he will say that Ukraine is a democracy and he has been democratically elected. But anyone with just an ounce of knowledge regarding international affairs knows that he is a puppet. Now, the situation in the Western world is changing, and changing quite dramatically and rapidly as a result of Trump entering the White House. It is very clear that just after 2 weeks or so of Trump having entered the White House, that he is going to war with the Western ruling elite. He's going to war with woke ideology. And so Trump is looking for a way to end the war with the war in Ukraine. But he will come up against a Russia which will say to him in private, "You did not start the war, Trump, but the Western ruling elites, your enemy, the American people's enemy, did. And we will finish the war however we want. And there is nothing you can do to stop us." So Trump will be in a position where he will have to say to the Russians, "You have to help me out. You have to allow me to end all support to the Ukrainian armed forces in a way which will not be seen in a bad light for my administration." So again, the Russians and the Americans will conduct high-level negotiations with each other, but the Russians will say, "Nothing can stop us now from winning in Ukraine. We've taken everything that can be thrown at us. You don't want this war, President Trump, but we didn't start it. We will end it, and we will never trust a word that comes out of the mouth of the West."
Sorry. It's as if you're saying that the meeting will be between Putin and Trump. Thank you very much, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, expert in international affairs, joining us.